she was wanting to welcome
Very
everybody.
strange.
She's
I can hear all of you just fine. Yeah.
But we can't hear you very well. She wants to welcome everybody. She's the host of this, and I am Rebecca Gibson. I run the Harrisville Poetry, the Loom Poetry in Harrisville.
Okay.
And Katrina would have told you, I don't know in what order, that you know that you can buy the books of these wonderful poets at the bottom of the screen below where you tabbed to come into this meeting.
You can't hear me at all. Okay.
Let me keep going. Okay.
Oh, fair enough.
Okay. There are three. First of all, let me welcome you from me, from the Loom, the Poetry in Harrisville, which is now, of course, online and not in Harrisville. With the help of our wonderful local bookstore, Toadstool Bookstore, who's hosting us, we're delighted to be able to gather across borders to celebrate 3 books from the distinguished and energetic 4-Way Books. That's a publishing house in New York that's really amazing, and its poets are always very impressive. Anyway, by 3 astonishing poets. I'm going to introduce each one briefly, and I say briefly because if you are on my mailing list, you have a longer bio about each poet, and the other way to get a longer bio is to buy the books or to go online and find them, but I just want to kind of hit some high points to give you a little context. In this novel era of Zoom connection, it seems important to honor both our ability to share this time and space and the actual physical locations that have shaped us. So I'm going to start each introduction with a very brief reference to where the poets live or have lived, which I hope I've got right about them. I'll only mention a few details of their biographies. Attached, no, anyway, that's all about that. Ready? Okay, so each poet will read for about 15 minutes and we'll have some time to talk together afterwards. The first is Angela Narciso Torres. This is her book. Angela was born in Brooklyn, raised in Manila, and currently resides in California. You can hear the range in her work, that range of place, of location, and moving. In addition to her new book that we are celebrating today, What Happens is Neither, that's the title, What Happens is Neither. Angela is the author of Blood Orange, winner of the Willow Books Literature Award for Poetry, and the chapbook To the Bone. A graduate of Warren Wilson's MFA program for writers and Harvard Graduate School of Education, Angela has received fellowships from Breadloaf Writers Conference, Illinois Arts Council, and Ragdale Foundation. She received first prize in the Yates Poetry Prize. New City Magazine named her one of Chicago's Lit 50, and she serves as senior and reviews editor for Rhino Poetry, and that's Rhino with an H. I recently read her new book in one open-mouthed, almost unbreathing gasp of multiple recognitions. It's not so much that I'd had similar experiences, but that she portrays the situations of the poems in stunning fragments that vibrate with accuracy and meaning. For instance, this poem on page 23 called Alzheimer's, about her mother. Alzheimer's. There was a piano she loved, cherubs carved on cherry wood. Hands ripple over ghost keys. She nods off, chin to chest. Do you want to lie down? No. Under the palms, in a pink house dress. What is your name? She asks, again. Cherubs playing violins. Sunlight slips behind ferns. So that last line, sunlight slips behind ferns. which sounds simple maybe, but speaks of the passage of time, of the disappearance of what was, from visible to inaccessible, from light to shadow. In this line, she accomplishes by understatement pathos. Angela.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was lovely. And I teared up a little bit there. I'm going to have to gather my wits about me before I start reading. But thank you so much for having us, truly. Thank you to the Loom reading series and to the wonderful people at the Toadstool Bookshop for hosting us. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here today. Thanks to my co-readers, Reg Gibbons and Kevin Prufer, and always to Four Way Books for publishing our books and for arranging all these readings for us. And most of all, thanks to all who tuned in today. I know that Zoom exhaustion is real, and I really appreciate that you chose to spend part of your Sunday afternoon with us today. I'll read 4 poems from my new book. And as you may have already gathered from Rebecca's introduction, the core of this book is the loss of my mother to Alzheimer's 2 years ago. This is my beautiful mother. As you see, she already perfected at the young age of, I think she's about 35 here, the side eye, which I still have to learn from her. So yeah, my mother passed from Alzheimer's, and then 11 days later, my father passed, as much from cancer as from his broken heart. And I wrote this poem, and indeed many of the poems in this book, about her slow decline, but also about how one survives loss and reinvents a self after loss. And this first poem was really a way to record what I could of my mother before her memory was completely gone. Her words, her stories, her perfume, the foods she preferred. Seamus Heaney once said, in poetry, small things can bear the weight of anything. And in this poem, there's a thimble, but it's really a stand-in for this little mug, this curious mug from Cuba, which my mother gave me shortly before she died. And I'm not sure where it came from because, you know, I've never been to Cuba. I don't think she has either. But okay, sundowning for my mother, Carmen. The sweetest meat clings to the bone, my mother says, knifing her steak. Carmen, silver spade on my tongue. Mahjong nights, her mother and father gone, she cried herself to sleep. Blamed in the morning for her mother's losing hand. Unlucky tears. The sweetest meat, she begins at dinner, tearing off a drumstick. What will she recall by morning? Named for Our Lady of Mount Carmel, she pinned brown scapulars under our shirts, wet stamps that cleaved to our backs. Carmen, prayer on the breath. Amid potted ferns, she works a jigsaw puzzle. Bizet on the radio. Unable to sleep, she made me lie next to her. My brothers clambered the banyan trees. My legs twitched, a broken clock. Her kisses are guava and rust. She sings kundimans her mother sang. Sampaguita, dahil sa'yo, saan ka man. Sunday morning, puzzle pieces strewn on yesterday's news. Maria Callas on the phonograph. Carmen, citrine fire. When she plays the piano, the lovebirds fall silent. Alabaster eggs tremble in glass bowls. Afternoons, she woke with an urge to bite the brown loaf of my arm. The marks on my flesh faded by sundown. The sweetest meat clings, she insists, peels a mango. Amber rivers trace her elbows. A trail of L'air du Temps wafts in her wake. I follow it to her room, dab the scent on my wrists and throat. Evenings, she sang kundimans, hating gabi, nasaan ka irog. Carmen, song of the mangosteen moon. Before you go, I want to give you something. She hands me a thimble painted with a map of Cuba. We've never been to Cuba. In the dream, a sister pours rosary beads into her cupped hands. Upon waking, a dead wasp curled in her palm. So while one of the book's central themes is loss, as I said, another equally salient theme is the reinventing of the self after loss and the rediscovery of delight. Some of this is captured in 3 self-portraits in the book, and here is one of them that features rosary beads. Rosary beads were kind of like a ritual that my parents shared. They prayed the rosary every night, and these are the rosary beads my father actually was holding and praying with on the night that he passed. And it's one of the talismans that I carry with me too since they died. Self-portrait as rosary beads. Curled amid lint and loose change, tucked in a jacket's satin lining, or crushed with used gum in seams of denim, I've known pain clinics and airports, taxi cabs, and stale school rooms where time is a honeycomb in winter. I'm olive wood, carnelian, plastic, black onyx. I'm rosebuds pressed into fragrant spheres. Your heat is my musk, your worry, my fire. Pick your mystery. If Tuesday, sorrowful. If Saturday, glorious. I've held you in grocery lines, picket lines, the hours between sleepless and woken. Hold me. I'm glass, shattered, smoothed by my mother's nerves, pillowed beneath her cheek. Counted, accountable, counting, counted on. Crystallized, dangled on a string or hung from a mirror in a river of traffic, praying for green, for an end, for a mutiny of rain, litany of sorrows, of praise. I'm a crown of roses, a crown of purple thorns. I'm faithful as breadcrumbs on barbed wire. Lose me to birds or to night's starred thicket. Touch and be splintered, sundered, soothed, surrendered, my scent on your fingertips. So the next poem is written in the golden shovel form, and it's a contemporary form developed by the American poet Terence Hayes. What Terence Hayes did was he borrowed a line of poetry from a Gwendolyn Brooks poem as in tribute to her, and each word of that borrowed line became an end word for the lines in his poem. The line that I borrowed from my poem is from William Butler Yeats, from his famous poem, The Circus Animal's Desertion, and the line is "The foul rag and bone shop of the heart." This is a poem about young motherhood, and what I love about poetry is that we can blend traditions from centuries ago to, current times, and I feel that that's one of the ways that we can push poetry forward. The foul rag and bone shop of the heart, a golden shovel using a line from William Butler Yeats. I'm not just talking about the sleepless days and nights, the nonstop nursing, the foul smelling diapers. I'm talking about how my body reeked, a soaked rag of curdled milk, drool, and leaky nappies, and how I'd wake already, beat beyond blood, bone, and breath, the babe still at my breast. But when I pushed past a shop window the other day, I turned to do a double take, a glimmer of a woman I once knew. No, it wasn't just the wind-tossed hair, the morning weary face, but oh, the heart, the heart. And I'll just read one more poem. My last poem is the title poem of the book, What Happens Is Neither, which is also the first line of the poem. As I said at the beginning, my dad and my mom both passed 11 days apart, but dad took care of her until she died. And one of the ways that he could best communicate with her and reach her, especially when her memory had completely gone, was to play the violin for her. He played the violin really beautifully. And one of the things that I kept of his was his violin, which I have with me here in my little writing room. And it became a talisman for me, really, as I was working on this book, of how music, how poetry can transcend language, especially when our own words fail. What happens is neither the end nor the beginning, yet we're wired to look for signs. Consider the peonies. One makes a perfect bud after months of nothing. Another's leaves are ringed with black rot. How can I not think end? How can I not say beginning? Leaves fall when days shorten because the tree must reduce to its tough parts, twig, branch, bark. My mother sleeps away the daylight. She nods off while chewing a spoonful of fish and rice, her head a peony gone to seed. Father calls to say she doesn't recognize him. Turning to him, she cried out, certain a stranger was in her bed. He played his violin till she slept, a leaf in late fall, curling into itself. In autumn, chlorophyll disappears, canceling green from leaves so yellow and magenta can blaze. In my mirror, I see her, the smile that favors a cheek, eyes slanting in the shape of small fish we eat for breakfast. Trees know best the now of things. What goes on has been going on for centuries. Washing dishes, I rest a foot on my standing leg. A fork clangs on the tile. I rinse a cracked cup. I try not to think of endings. Thank you.
Oh,
Thanks so much.
thank you, Angela. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
One advantage of Zoom is you can bring your violin.
That's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, you could even bring your oboe or your bass or whatever instrument. Thank you so much again for that lovely introduction. It really kind of set the tone for my reading. And I'm so excited to hear Reg and Kevin.
Good. So Kevin was born in Cleveland, Ohio, in the sort of middle of the country. Now he teaches West and East at the University of Houston and the Massachusetts-based Lesley University Low Residency MFA program. He is the author of 7 poetry collections. He's been awarded by the Poetry Society of America, received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and others. His poems appear regularly in Best American Poetry. His book, Churches, was named one of the 10 best poetry books of the year by the New York Times, and he's been longlisted for the Pulitzer Prize. I first encountered Kevin a while ago as an editor at Pleiades Review. He is not only an extraordinary poet, but an engaged and generous member of the poetry community. As examples of his contributions to the world are the anthologies he's co-edited, including New European Poets, Poets on Overlooked Poems, New Young American Poets, before that was popular to do, and Lost American Masters. You can see from this partial list that he is attentive to the neglected. What I've always loved in his poems is the quirky tenderness within an unflinching catalog of our self-inflicted devastations, all plain spoken, stark, all the more haunting and horrifying for the fond familiarities. The poem of his I'm going to read, oh, I should show you his book. Wait till you see the cover. The Art of Fiction. This poem is called, And He Will Guide My Craft. That is not a burning building. It is a bonfire on the beach. And those are not soldiers, they are fishermen. I am rowing us closer so you will see how those are not guns, but fishing poles. A star is not a fighter plane. An island is not an aircraft carrier. And can you see the fishermen cooking their catch in the fire? I'm rowing us closer. Do you hear their laughter in the wind? Yes, it sounds like people crying, but it is not. Do you hear the fire popping? Yes, it sounds like pistols taking prisoners to the afterlife, but it is not. I have always been with you. These are my hands rowing your boat. We shouldn't be on open water when the sun rises. We will dock here. This is a peaceful island. You can rest. You can eat. That is not smoke. It is mist wrapping the cliffs while the fishermen tend their fires. Oh, those are not bodies. They are people sleeping. We will leave our boat behind. When I say run, we will run as fast as we can across the sand. Don't look back. You will disappear into the woods, and I will disappear into your mind. So with that, Kevin.
Well, that was a really nice introduction, and so funny to hear one's poem read back to one through a computer. It's interesting. Wow, thank you, Rebecca, and I'm going to echo Angela and thanking Four Way Books also, which has just been the dream publisher for me, and yeah, and I'm so happy to have found what feels like a permanent, hopefully, feels like a permanent home there.
Excuse me, Kevin, you might want to turn up your volume a little bit.
Okay. I'm gonna pull the computer closer. How's that? Okay. Excellent. I'm going to read this poem called In the Bad Days. I am writing to you from deep in the bad days, hoping you will hear me wherever you are, far away in a better time. In a better time, hoping you will hear me far away wherever you are. I came upon a heron late at night, deep in these bad days. Late tonight, deep in our bad days. He plucked a frog from the water-filled ditch. His eye was black glass. I am writing to you wherever you are, late in my bad days. The frog's neck was broken, so its legs dangled. The heron eyed me blackly from its wet ditch. I'm writing to you from deep in the black days. The dead dangled. I watched from the sidewalk. The heron's glass eye eyed me in the streetlight's glare. Wherever you are, in a better time, people were dying. I am writing to tell you, people are dying. Remember that while you tie your shoes to go for your walk through the sun-filled night, through the beautiful night in another time. I'm going to read a poem that I've never actually read out loud before. It was the last addition to this book, and it's a book about fiction. That's why it's called The Art of Fiction. I was imagining it was a book about, where fiction exists in our minds and how we make fictional things non-fictional. So I wrote this poem, and at the last minute we pulled out one that now I'm really glad I pulled it out and slipped this one right in there, like right before it went to press. It's called Into the Weeds. The brutality of those two men who broke into her apartment and murdered her boyfriend, then as she stepped from the shower, shot her too right in the face, so she crumbled over the bathtub, a little blood leaking from her mouth onto the white tiles, has stayed with me, though it was something I saw in a film class years ago and was fictional. What must it be like for those two men who asked to get rid of a federal witness actually did it? I don't mean the actors, one of whom I recognized vaguely from another movie, but the men who lived in the mind of the writer who created that scene. I suppose it is like nothing at all to them, since they have exited the writer's mind and now exist entirely within the conventions of cinema. Years ago, my professor explained it this way. Cinema is committed to a pact with the audience that allows for certain unreal elements to pass as real. The camera following those two men as they pocket their guns and walked toward the door. Whose perspective was that exactly? and the fade out as we moved forward in time several weeks. How did that happen in just an instant? Those men lived inside a flickering screen that the rest of us can't inhabit. But let me tell you this. Back when I was taking that film course, I had a friend named Adam. He was real, an obsessive cyclist. He studied chemistry and kept a row of Star Wars action figures on a shelf in his dorm room. Then, one day, he died. He was watching TV in his room, and then he was not anymore. It was my first experience of the death of someone I loved. I was sitting on the porch studying German verbs when I heard. The porch tilted upward, so I couldn't hold on, and all of me kept tumbling sideways toward the yard. He has been 18 and unpredictable for 30 years now. I have many anecdotes about him, which is to say he now exists within the conventions of the anecdote. A funny kid I knew when I was a serious kid. A guy I last saw shirtless and asleep on a sunny Tuesday on the quad, making of his yellow Frisbee a pillow, while sunlight filtered through the trees, sending mottled shadows across his chest. For the dead, death is the entire truth. What else could there be? But like the dead, those two men waiting in that woman's apartment, screwing silencers onto their handguns, also exist in the minds of those who remember them, where the fictional and the dead become, over time, similar. He was my best friend. We sat together in film class, quietly making fun of the professor who paced back and forth in the lecture hall, waving her dry erase marker over her head, talking about Scorsese's clever manipulation of the passage of time in that scene where the woman bleeds to death on the tiles. Conventions that make the unreal real. The security distance provides. It was as if the porch lifted up completely and tilted sideways, and all the furniture and I tumbled over the rail into the weeds. I'll read just two more poems. Like Angela, I'll do four. That's like a good one. This one's just called Rain. Before rain, the windows grew thick with fog. Mist descended over the evening rooftops, and rain made generalities of the neighborhood. Rain made red leaves stick to car windows. Rain made the houses vague. A car slid through rain past rows of houses. The moon swiveled on a wet gear above it. The moon, a searchlight suspended from one of the airships, lit the vague face peering through the windshield. The car sliding down the rain-filled darkness toward the highway. The men controlling the airships were searching for him, and he passed through the rain as a thought passes through the collective mind of the state. Here I am in this rain-filled poem, looking out my kitchen window into the street, having read the news of the day. We are hunting them in our neighborhoods. They have no place among us. And now the car has turned the corner and disappeared into the searchlights that make from the rain glittering cylinders of power. I'm gonna end on a poem about translation, since we're talking about fiction. I was introduced this poem by saying I went to hear a translator give a lecture here in Texas where I live. And he began his lecture by saying, a poem in translation is like the dead body of a foreigner washed up on our shores. And the thing I remember about that was everybody in the audience, it seemed, and me, I'm guilty, kind of went, oh, oh. And then it just gnawed at me, that thing. And the more I thought about it, I couldn't pay attention to his lecture. I spent the whole time thinking about how horrible that metaphor was. And just like violent. So anyway, I wrote this poem for him. It's called The Translator. A poem in translation, the young man was fond of saying, is like the dead body of a foreigner washed up on our shore. Here, he usually paused to let the metaphor sink in. Some members of the audience nodded thoughtfully. I will now read from my translations of a little-known ancient Roman poet, he told them, shuffling his papers, then looking into the dark, half-empty auditorium. The dead body refused to be still. The waves loved it too much, pushing it onto the beach, then rolling it seaward again. And so it made its way down the beach, alighting for a moment or several moments on the wet sand, then bobbing out again among the American swimmers. 120 foreigners in a leaking boat is too many. So the ocean fills with poems. Some retain the qualities of their original language, but others sink into a new language. Here I am out here. I can see your oil rigs glittering on the horizon, says the young woman who no one listens to. Or she says nothing, clinging to the side of the waterlogged boat where she has floated all night among the drifting bodies. A few of them became tangled among the oil rigs, while others arrived gently on our shore. A poem that has floated some distance from its accident transforms, so the people ran away in horror when at last he came to rest on a crowded part of the beach. You foreigners in your many sailed ships, come join the empire, the translator intones from his spot-lit podium, and the audience sighs. Here I am, out here, says a little voice inside the translation, a voice no one, not even the translator, can hear. The audience had come to hear a lecture on poetry in translation, and now the translator was going on about that ancient Roman tendency to absorb and therefore transform foreign cultures, their gods and foods. Outside the auditorium, it had grown dark, a perfect summer night. The 1,000 vessels on the great black ocean glittered and loomed, and for days bodies washed up on the beach. Now the American workers zippered them into vinyl bags, which, in the translator's metaphor, constitutes a kind of publication. But what is there to say about that young woman still clinging to the wreckage 2 days into my poem? A gentle summer rain prickles her skin. Here I am, she says, looking toward the oil rigs hunkering between her and the shore. Here I am. She is a very fine woman, and someone should translate her. Thank you.
Such extraordinary, interesting voices in your poems. Reginald. Reginald Gibbons was born in Houston, Texas. He majored in Spanish and Portuguese at Princeton University, earned an MA in English and creative writing, and a PhD in comparative literature from Stanford University. He taught Spanish at Rutgers and creative writing at Princeton and Columbia University before moving to Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, where he is Francis Hooper Professor of Arts and Humanities. He is the author of 11 poetry collections, finalist for the National Book Award, published in the National Poetry Series, and has won fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Center for Hellenic Studies, among many awards. His work is included in the Best American Poetry and Pushcart Prize anthologies, translated into Spanish, Italian, and French. And he has a book on poetic technique called How Poems Think. There is, to my knowledge, nothing like this book, Renditions. Whoops. Paper is flying everywhere. Here it is. And apparently the cover is by Reg, right? And no one more qualified by linguistic expertise, poetic confidence, and humanitarian perspective to write it. Most of the poems in Renditions are renderings, versions of, performances of poems by other writers. The range is huge, from 797 BCE piece by Sophocles through the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, and geographically expansive as well. But here's the thing. It is Gibbons' own wide-ranging voice linking with those others, connected to them. The acts of this book imply and exemplify his and our shared living. Take this poem I'm about to read, which sounds like a contemporary apocalypse sounding poem. It's called The Names of Everyone, and reconsider our sort of self-referential sense of how unique our losses are. The Names of Everyone. When my horse and I arrive at the shattered past, I spur her on, but that lost, empty place drags my spirit to itself, pulls me away from me. As the mare quickens her pace, the past keeps up with us, leaping along the rubble and tilted stonework of half-fallen walls and towers, and from tomb to tomb. The mare's hooves clop softly in the pale dirt of winding narrow weed field paths where most of this gone city once stood. I am not the only one who's tried to go back beyond such wholly emptied places. Rocking chair oak limbs are creaking under the heavy dead souls that perch on them. Two extinct avian species that I recognize offer their alarm calls to this hour. As the horse and I cross soft shadowed ground underneath a stand of pines, another bird, some cautious thrush I don't know the name of, catches my mood, looking me straight in my mind, its tiny, nearly weightless body angled physically. I ask my horse the bird's name. She only glances at me, then says, "Can you tell me, what were the names of everyone of whom now no one knows?" And then you look at the little afterword thing that tells you the poem is a rendition of Han Shan, who was a Chinese Buddhist monk around 800. So our losses and the profoundness of our losses is not a new thing. Reginald.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for the reading of the poem. I really appreciate that. And of course, I want to thank the Loom, the whole poetry community of the Loom, and I want to thank Toadstool Bookshops and Four-Way Books, everyone at Four-Way Books. I'm really very, very happy to be here as one of Four-Way Books' poets. This little poem I'll read first is a fragment. It's pretty close to the original. It's a fragment from a lost tragedy by Sophocles. So I titled it On Song. It's lost from an ode, and the ode belonged to a play, and everything's lost except for a few fragments. On Song, which for us means poetry. Forgetting, named Lethe by Memory's daughters, the Muses, is hated. Lethe is not to be loved, not she. For mortals, what sweet power there is in song, what deepest heart, what delight that can make bearable this narrow, short, winding stream of life. When you come across something like that, it's pretty hard not to want to put it into English. The next poem is after just a few lines by the Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva. She wrote these are lines taken from a poem she wrote in 1918, and you'll see that I went completely to a new place, but I don't think I would have ever gotten there if I hadn't read her lines. The title is Lurid and Lunatic, and those are two of her words, sort of. It's a little narrative. To such absurdity, the daylight was deaf. A seat in a minivan to some other place. That's all I asked. All right, okay, I'll donate more of my money to the richest? No. Okay, no. At the inauguration, I marched along the edge of a ray of light that something had bribed to a blur. I should have said this is not about the most recent inauguration, but the prior inauguration. An official bandit demanded I never again vote. They said I should sign. Sign it, they said. And why don't those folks in the low hope neighborhoods, they said. They should buy our campaign hats too. It's dumb of them not to be nice. They don't make sure to smile and cheer for the big guy so he don't smile back. Well, I said, well, eagle-eyed America cannot transit the eye of no such needle. And then the bandit, the tall one who'd stomped on my hopes and blocked me getting on the citizenship, he began to cry into a red, white, and blue bucket, hugging it, laughing with it, looking mean. The huge crowd, huge, so huge, they got soaked by the freezing tears of bruised clouds shaped like alligators. And the petroleum soggy frauds of big real estate had spilled onto the street and opioided the blind earth under the aching feet of all the depressed trees and the jackboots of the spokespersons for the lost cause and hell. And the daylight detested all those limos that stood up on their hind wheels and danced, and all the lurid and lunatic hoopla that was staggering and howling and gurgling by. I think this is in the same mood, but this one's somber. It's after a poem by another Chinese poet named Chang Ko-chu, who lived around the year 1300. I just took his poem and moved it somewhere else. View from an Oklahoma hilltop. I moved it somewhere else so that he could speak about the Oklahoma hilltop. The wind saws itself against the thick blades of red granite ridges. Over the jagged boulder humps and tumbled down peaks of these low, stoop-shouldered former mountains, it scrapes itself. Its breath riffles the rainwater pools and shallow stone hollows. The high rock ridge is splashed white with hawk scat and with a quartz cracking lichen like cold yellow-orange flame. Below, a harrier glides over the dry lake bed, dead shells, savage little burrs, a delicate sharp-toothed skull. The wind tears at itself and rushes into voice through spiky scrub oak leaves. The rattlesnake is wild. The spider is wild. The cougar is wild. What makes such savage wildness seem tame is memories of what men have done. This is from a few words from a poem by Marina Tsvetaeva from 1916. Lips, hands, eyes. Lips that need no brand names. Hands that dream the score of a gigue or await an escape into fugues. Eyes that do not close when they see hungry, displaced children, or unpleasant paupers, or beat up out of tune pianos, or books that are searching a dim house for a lit lamp. This poem I call Spell. It's after a poem by Bertolt Brecht that I found a long time ago and have since lost and never found again. Spell. But this charms green in the red world, low leaf that opens anyway among dry pebbles by a hard road. In the chained world, this charm is free. A private charm against goodbyes when you and I release each other. The farewell kiss, those lost child cries we swallow, this turning to a feather. I kiss your mouth. That's what I seek. This charms a statement and reply, and a seed, a wedge, a way to take what's good into our work today. This kiss is given at the border of night, leaf that is ours, love that is green. Give us all more life, more blue note, soul hours and days together again. Well, there are two horses in my book. Rebecca introduced the first one. This is the second one. This is a very close version of a poem by the great Cesar Vallejo, the Peruvian poet, who died in 1938. This is from his second book, which is called Trilce, Trilce, a word that has no known meaning, only suggestions of meaning. It's an autobiographical sort of a voice, and I'm trying to ventriloquize it. It's dark when we arrive at the doorway where I spoke my long ago goodbye as the rooster was singing one of his epics. The door's locked. I call out and there's no answer. The stone bench beside the door where Mama brought my big brother into this bright world so he would saddle backs for me. But I would later ride them bare, rambling through narrow streets and out beyond, village boy that I was. This very bench of stone is where I left my hard childhood to yellow in the sun. And this doorway, framed by grief, God and his peace, somewhere else, far from this place. My horse, mere beast, snorts. He too is calling to them. He's scented something. He clops his hooves on the cobblestones. He snorts, but he's not sure. He swivels his pricked ears. Papa must still be up, praying. Maybe even now he's still fretting. Something's made this boy late. My simple-hearted sisters incessantly whispering their busy little fantasies to each other, getting ready for a holy day that's not coming. Almost everything has been prepared for it. I hope and wait. My heart's an egg that almost, but something's blocking it. Something's in the way. That big family we forsook not so long ago. This night, nobody's still awake. Nobody's put even one candle on the altar so that we'd come back, my soul and I. I call out again, and nothing. I and my soul both hush. We begin to weep. The animal snorts, tosses his head, whinnies. But for all eternity, they're all asleep. Yet this is so much for the best that at last my tired horse standing beside me shakes his head, softly jiggling his bridle and the reins. But he falls asleep. Then he wakes. He bows his head low this night. He falls asleep again. And every time he wakes, he nods to me and he says, "It's all right. Everything's all right." Losing my place here. I put all the flags in the book and then I can't find them. This is a poem that's I've translated from Osip Mandelstam's Russian. He wrote it in 1913. All I could do with it is to try to make it about a third as beautiful as it is in Russian. Not that I know Russian, but I have been working for about 12 years with a Russian poet translating Russian poetry. So I've learned a lot about poetry that I didn't know before. I call this What Remains. In Russian, the poem titles are always the first lines. Yes, bread that's poisoned, and not even one sip of air. How hard it is for the wound of life to be cured. Joseph himself, sold to Egypt as a slave, could not have been more heavily grieved. Then under the sky swarm of stars, Bedouins come. They quiet their horses. Sorry, third poem with a horse in it. Then in turn, with eyes closed, each invents some chanted fragment of their day of epic nothing that only brought them boredom. For among such writers, little's needed to inspire. In the dunes, one man lost a quiver of arrows. Others traded some geldings for a mare. Events are only a mist that thins and disappears. But if such songs are sung out to the end, with all the heart, with all the breath in the lungs, almost everything vanishes. And what remains is the desert vastness, the stars, the one who sings. Thank you.
We are so lucky to have heard you three, really lucky. Thank you. At this point, if you would like to, if you have anything you think you'd like to hear the poets talk about, please, I don't know quite how we're going to do this, but you can unmute yourself or raise your hand and I will try to see you and call on you. And I can start us off because I know getting started is always the hardest thing. I was wondering about it from each of you, if you can articulate what's different about this book than your previous book that you were either aware of or not aware of as you were working on it. Or you can answer, you can talk about anything else and pretend I didn't ask this.
I don't mind going first.
Okay.
All the poems in this book have been made in response to, and sometimes, with parts of, or whole poems out of other poems. Sometimes only a few lines, sometimes just a few words. Sometimes I just move it to a new place, a new language. And the reason I ended up doing this, going back to some old translations, in fact, and freeing them a bit from the limitations I placed on them, was because English wanted to know how to do some new things. Seems like it felt that way to me. There are things you can do in Spanish and French and German and Russian and ancient Greek that are very hard to do in English, and they're probably not brought over into English by me in a way that anyone would think, oh, that must be from some other language. But for me, each of those things opened up a kind of poetic idea that I wouldn't otherwise have had. So
before anyone else answers, Katrina, there we go. Okay, now other people can unmute. Kevin or Angela?
Well, I got really, I mean, I think my writing sort of changes more glacially, but I started in sort of a few books ago writing these sort of mostly kind of long narrative poems, that a couple of which you heard today. And I got very interested in the way time passes in a poem, and I got kind of convinced of this idea that what makes a narrative poem has less to do with how much story is in there. You know, at certain, what is it, like at a certain point, there's like enough story taken out that we're in the land of the lyrical poem or something. I didn't really buy that idea. I got very interested in the idea that the writer of a poem, of a narrative poem, is sort of the god of the poem who controls the passage of time and how time works. And I got fascinated with that idea, the manipulation of time and what can happen to time when we bend it. And I also got interested in this idea that maybe the idea that makes sort of maybe humankind different from other animals walking the planet is our ability to create fictions that we all can agree upon, and then we can agree upon them into fact. Like that if enough of us believe it, then it's real. Like with money, for instance, I think it would be a good example of that. So these two sort of twin thoughts about the passage of time and agreed upon fiction really living in the back of my mind when I wrote this new book. So that's why I called it The Art of Fiction. I hear there's another book called The Art of Fiction. That's not my book.
I guess for me, the main difference between my first and second books are the modes in which I wrote the poems. My first book was a poetic memoir of my growing up years in the Philippines and my eventual move to the United States as an adult. And as I said, the second book is more of a meditation on loss. And while I think I'll always be a poet who writes from personal experience, I was more conscious of the need to use form in the second book, probably because the material was so difficult to talk about. And I think it was Henri Cole who once said that a poem is like a genie in a bottle. The bottle makes the genie stronger. So I felt that by constraining the poems in forms like the cento or the pantoum or sonnets even, or even the golden shovel, where you're given a framework with which you can kind of constrain the material, helped me to find the shapes of these poems. And I kind of allowed the poems, as far as ordering the second book, to just kind of have an associative logic rather than a linear arc, which the first book had. Yeah, so that's the main difference, I think.
Alice Fogel just informed us all that The Art of Fiction title was also used by John Gardner, a novel.
I was asked what kinds of things that English can't do, I learned how to do. I'll give two little examples from a poem called, in my book, called Paris, Moscow. It's taken from several poems by Marina Tsvetaeva, lines from different poems. They had a correspondence in poems as well as in letters, and she believed that they were fated by, I don't know, fated to have been the couple of all time, artistic couple, because they never actually saw each other in person, I think. Anyway, for example, turning things, I don't know how to put this, inside out, or turning them in into a negative, into a positive. Here's what she says. We failed not to become, each of us, a world apart from the other. We failed not to become a world apart from the other, meaning that's very complicated. Not something I would have ever thought of trying to express, because I'm not sure that I ever had the sense to see it the way she did. Another one in the same poem is, she makes use of something that Pasternak used also, which is a deep belief that language writes poems, not poets. And so what you do in Russian is you have to listen to what the language is trying to tell you. Her way of doing it was to listen to the sounds inside long Russian words and figure out a word to use next that she herself could never have predicted she would have used. My Russian co-translator, poet friend Ilya Kuti calls this centrifugal rhyme. Rhyme meant to throw the poem off course. It never comes back on course. It keeps going off course. And it goes off course because one word calls to another one. Or the way Pasternak put it was that rhyme words, one word finds the other rhyme word. It finds the word that it loves. I could quote some more things that sort of drift into my poems from Russian that are just different versions of this, but it's really interesting to listen to words you've put down, perhaps without a whole lot of forethought, in fact, in a very intuitive mood, you know, but then to go back and look at them and ask what other words are sort of asking to be said in relation to those words. That's something that I translated a lot before I started on Russian. I call myself the greatest Russian expert on poetry who knows no Russian, except yes and no. But that's because I've spent 12 years having it explained to me when I was being told over and over again by my co-translator, you're not getting it. You're not getting it. It's a great education. Okay, I'll stop there.
I'm going to jump in again. Angela, the cento, could you talk to people about how that works? It's a really interesting form, and it seems sort of related in some odd way to what Reginald is also doing.
Well, the cento is an Italian form from the fourth century, I believe, and it borrows lines from other poets, from other famous poems. And cento means 100. So in the Italian form, it was 100 lines of poetry that they borrowed. In the centos that I write in this book, I borrow from not other poets or poems, but from nonfiction works. Like there's one from Virginia Woolf's diaries. There's another one from Catherine Mansfield's journal. And I've written others from Lucille Clifton's journal. And I do this because I feel that there's something about the writing life that we can get from these sources that we don't necessarily get from these people's poems or fiction. And I feel like I have this at my disposal. I can use this to give voice to something that hasn't been heard in this way in a poem. And it also gives voice to my own internal landscape. And generally what I do is I'll borrow the lines and I'll arrange them in a pentum form, which is a Malaysian form, another blending of traditions where the lines are repeated over and over and kind of braided together throughout the poem. So I didn't read one today, but maybe at a future reading I will.
Oops. Does anyone want to speak? In which case, is that Joan raising your hand? Nope.
Someone had a question about the golden shovel. Yeah, it's just a form created by Terence Hayes in his book Hip Logic. And yeah, well, no, it wasn't in Hip Logic, but if you Google golden shovel, Terence Hayes, the rules will be apparent. It will be quite easy to follow.
I want to thank you all and thank Four Way for bringing you to us, and thank everybody who came. It's great to see you, and I wish I could see all of you. I wish you'd whatever your video so we can see you. Oh,
Mhm.
hi. Hi, sister. This is really wonderful. The Loom has, by the way, our next reading is going to be April 11th with Dee Dee Jackson and Major Jackson, also at 4:30 on a Sunday, April 11th. And if you want to be on my mailing list, so I let you know directly, write to me at Rebecca Gibson 55@gmail.com, and I'll put you on our mailing list. It's great to see you all. Have a wonderful rest of your night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
Rebecca.
Thanks, Rebecca. Zoom by anytime.
Okay, there's the other.